I think it goes against most of the things that President Trump campaigned on, that the unintended consequences of regime change in Iraq actually led to instability in the Middle East and actually made the conditions worse in the Middle East. So it perplexes me that he is now nominating for Secretary of State someone who has advocated and pushed for regime change in Iran. With regard to the nomination of Gina Haspel, I am troubled by her participation in the Black Ops site in Thailand. And can you grab that for me? Particularly troubling, I think, is this quote from her time there and from the time when the torture was actually occurring. The quote from one of the interrogators says that Gina Haspel said, "Good job. I like the way you're drooling." This is about Zubeydeh, who, as he was being waterboarded. It adds to the realism. I'm almost buying it. You wouldn't think a grown man would do that. When you read that, sort of the joyful glee at someone who's being tortured, I find it just amazing that anyone would consider having this woman at the head of the CIA. And so my opposition to her is over her direct participation in interrogation and her gleeful enjoyment at the suffering of someone being tortured. So my announcement today is that I will oppose both Pompeo's nomination and Haspel's nomination. We'll take questions.
Will you do everything you can to stop the Secretary of State nomination because your committee is closely divided, Democrats all vote against?
Absolutely. And there are certain issues that I think, people complain sometime about the filibuster. They complain about trying to obstruct. I think the debate over whether or not America is a country that is in favor of torture or not is an important one. We've asked Pompeo before about his quotes on enhanced interrogation, torture, waterboarding, and he's basically stuck by the fact that he doesn't believe it's torture. And that to me is very troubling and one of the reasons I opposed him at the CIA.
Senator Paul, yesterday the President said, I'm really at a point where we're getting very close to having the cabinet that I want. So it sounds like more change is expected. Is that concerning to you?
I think one step at a time. I'm mostly concerned about the appointment to Secretary of State and CIA, and I'm going to do everything I can to block them. I think that other positions may not rise to this. I've supported several of the President's cabinet picks. I still do support President Trump. I think he's done a lot of good things. In fact, I think the Republican Congress has done a lot of good things. But appointing someone to be a head of CIA who is actively involved with waterboarding someone and was gleefully sort of, just expressing their joy at his suffering, I think is the wrong kind of message to send the world. I have members of my family who are in the actively serving the country, and I don't want the message to be that if members of our armed services are captured, that since torture is okay with the Americans, it's going to be fine to torture Americans when they're captured. And I think that is the message that it sends, and I think this is a debate that's really worth having, and applies really to both candidates on torture, both Pompeo and Haspel. But I think in particular, the lessons of the Iraq War. The President says over and over again the Iraq War was a mistake. But the lesson of the Iraq War being a mistake was that regime change has unintended consequences. If you appoint the people who are unapologetic in their support for the Iraq War and they also advocate for regime change in Iran, it's sort of like nobody got the message of the Iraq War. That was the message of the Iraq War, that regime change wasn't always a good idea and that there were unintended consequences of regime change.
Have you spoken with the President about this, and if not, what would you say?
I would say to the President, I haven't spoken to him, but what I would say to the President is pick people who support your policy. I actually do support the policies that he talks about, that the Iraq War was a mistake. Most of the people that have been appointed to the foreign policy team are people who are still in favor of the Iraq War. That's the real irony here, is President strongly against the Iraq War, and yet all the people being appointed around him are people who still support the Iraq War. I mean, for goodness sakes, they were in discussions with Bolton as well on this. Another unapologetic supporter of the Iraq War, for regime change in Iran, for regime change and a preemptive strike in North Korea. I mean, these are the crazy neoconservatives that really have opposed Trump on everything, and he's actually considering and has appointed many of these people to his cabinet.
So have you spoken to the President, not so much about this nomination, but the bigger issue that you bring up about waterboarding, enhanced interrogation, because those were things that he did seem to signal a more openness to than you certainly do in the campaign
Yeah, but also, since he's become president, he said that his discussions with Mattis had made him reassess that position, that waterboarding is not effective. And so I think Mattis's position has had some effect on the president. But the people he's appointing, I mean, to really appoint the head cheerleader for waterboarding to be head of the CIA, I mean, how could you trust somebody who did that to be in charge of the CIA? And I think it's galling. I mean, to read of her glee during the waterboarding is just absolutely appalling. Yes?
I have a question. That section that you are quoting from, is that from the Senate Intelligence Committee report?
Yes, I think it's from the report, and it's an article written, I think it's by Raymond Bonner. And Jim, do you remember which?
We'll get it to you.
Okay.
We'll get it to you. But it's a direct quote from, I think it's a book written by two of the interrogators, the two psychologists, but they quote her directly in their book.
Okay, so I want you to respond to the counter-argument. The counter-argument is that these policies were signed off by the Bush administration. They were carried out by these officers. They were considered lawful at the time. And even Director Brennan said that the program gathered useful information for the bin Laden brain.
You know, I think this has been historically a question we've asked in every war. Is there a point at which soldiers say no? And actually, I think part of the Army Service Manual has in it that if you believe something that you're being asked to do is unconstitutional or goes against the Geneva Convention or goes against something that it would be moral and right, soldiers do have the right to refuse. I mean, we've had this in other wars where horrendous things happened. You know, horrendous things happened in World War II, and people said, well, the German soldiers were just obeying orders. And so, no, I don't accept. I think there is a point at which, even suffering repercussions, that if someone asks you to torture someone, that you should say no. But you certainly should. The thing is so you could argue, what should we do with them? You know, there were people who wanted those people prosecuted, and then there were some of us who said, well, at least if they're not going to be in positions of authority, that's at least some punishment for their participation in this. But to reward somebody, to make them head of the CIA after they're involved with something so horrendous and I believe to be illegal, I think is a terrible, terrible message to send the world.
Just follow up one last thing on that. By blocking this nomination, you will also be effectively blocking the first woman to head up this agency, which is of tremendous significance.
Yeah. I don't look at any nomination based on sex, creed, race, color, or anything. I just look at them on the individual. So this could be a man, this could be a woman, this could be anybody of any race. If you were in charge of a black ops site in Thailand and you were gleefully gloating as someone was being suffocated, I think that's not somebody I would vote for, regardless of their gender. Yes? We'll see. Senator McCain has voiced some misgivings about the CIA appointment, so we'll see what happens. If he alone were to say no, I think it might be enough, actually. So we'll see, and it depends on the solidarity of the Democrats. Senator Feinstein was said to have, by news reports, have blocked Ms. Haspel from advancement at the CIA. We'll see if she has the courage of her convictions to actually vote no.
But Senator Pompeo had, I think it was 15 Senate Democrats supported him the first time around. He's been vetted by this process before.
Right.
Do you really see it as likely that he will be defeated?
I think it's unknown. I think people sometimes do vote differently for different cabinet positions, and some people see the head of the CIA as being sort of the head of law enforcement and not so much a political position, and that the Secretary of State is a more political position. To my mind, the question I ask every ambassador that comes through the committee and everybody that's going to be appointed to the State Department that I get voted on is I ask them a simple question. Do you realize that the primary function of the State Department is diplomacy, not war? And so somebody that's advocating for regime change doesn't really sound like someone you'd want to have as your chief diplomat. Really, seriously, do you think we can have discussions with other countries if we're advocating for regime change? At least somebody needs to be advocating for diplomacy. So I think Pompeo doesn't necessarily fit the role of someone I would say would be the chief diplomat. Yes?
Are you concerned about the growing high-profile administration resignations? How do you think the White House handled Tillerson's departure?
I think that Tillerson was useful in balancing some of the views in the administration. So you had some, McMaster's wants to send 100,000 troops into Afghanistan. You had people like Tillerson that I think were a balancing point of view, and it was important to have him in the administration. And you often heard him talk about diplomacy, which is what the State Department is supposed to be involved in. So I think the replacement of Tillerson with Pompeo will be the replacement of someone who is advocating diplomacy for someone who's advocating regime change, not necessarily a step upward.
Last question, Garrett.
Are you concerned about the possibility of extended vacancies then? And if you fight this tooth and nail, that leave these positions open when there's so much going on or
Certainly there is a career officer at the CIA who did not directly participate in waterboarding that we could nominate. And so there are many people over at the CIA that I would vote for. In fact, probably most career nominees from the CIA I think would be fine. Particularly picking and rewarding someone who is in charge of something so heinous, I think is a real big mistake, and it sends a terrible message to the world. And we have soldiers in, probably 80 different countries around the world that are potential for kidnapping or for capture. And I think the idea that we would be saying here at home, oh, we're fine with torture and waterboarding, I think would be a terrible message if any of our soldiers are captured. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed.